put your phone or device aside and immerse yourself in this audio story. Perfect for listening on the move, while relaxing, or for bedtime listening. We release new stories daily, so make sure to like and subscribe to not miss out. This story is based on true events. The Tokyo Extraction, December 29th, 2019. Security cameras at Kansai International Airport capture something unusual. A private jet lifts off from Japanese soil, bound for Istanbul. Inside its cargo hold, hidden within a large black music equipment case with breathing holes drilled into the sides, sits one of the world's most powerful CEOs. His passport has been confiscated. His movements monitored 24/7. He's facing decades in a Japanese prison. Yet somehow, impossibly, Carlos Ghosn, the man who saved two of the world's largest automakers, has just pulled off one of the most audacious escapes in corporate history. But here's what they don't tell you. This wasn't just an escape from justice. This was the final act in a shadow war between East and West, between old money and new power, between tradition and disruption. And the man in the box, he might not be the villain they said he was, or he might be something far worse. To understand how a CEO ends up fleeing a G7 nation in a musical instrument case, you need to understand what Carlos Ghosn represented and what he threatened. Born in Brazil to Lebanese parents, Ghosn carved his reputation in the blood-soaked battlefields of corporate restructuring. At Michelin, he closed factories. At Renault, he fired 21,000 workers. They called him Le Cost Killer, and he wore the name like armor. This wasn't compassion. This was surgical corporate violence in service of shareholder returns, and he was extraordinarily good at it. In 1999, Nissan was dying. The company had $20 billion in debt, 8 consecutive years of losses, and a corporate culture so rigid it had calcified into paralysis. Japanese business tradition demanded consensus, patience, lifetime employment. Ghosn brought a sledgehammer. Within months, he closed 5 factories and eliminated 21,000 jobs. Unthinkable in Japan's employment for life culture. He dissolved traditional supplier relationships that had existed for generations. He broke keiretsu bonds that were considered sacred. And it worked. By 2001, Nissan was profitable again. By 2003, Ghosn had eliminated the entire debt burden. The Japanese media, initially skeptical of this foreign corporate raider, crowned him a business savior. Manga comics featured him as a superhero. He became the rare gaijin, foreigner, to penetrate the inner sanctum of Japanese corporate power. But here's the dark business story they didn't print in those manga comics. Ghosn wasn't just saving companies. He was building an empire. By 2005, he simultaneously ran both Renault and Nissan, an unprecedented concentration of automotive power. Later, he would add Mitsubishi Motors, creating a 3-headed alliance that sold 1 in 9 cars globally. Combined revenue, $200 billion annually. He became the most powerful figure in the global auto industry, a king with factories on 6 continents. And like all kings, he lived like one. Private jets, homes in Paris, Beirut, Rio, Amsterdam, New York, a carnival party in Brazil that cost $600,000, a lavish wedding at Versailles, compensation packages worth tens of millions annually from multiple companies simultaneously. This wasn't just wealth. This was a statement. I am beyond your rules. But wealth and power in the business world are never just about money. They're about control. And in the shadowy corridors where corporate strategy meets national interest, Carlos Ghosn was playing a dangerous game. The Renault-Nissan alliance was always asymmetrical, always unstable. Renault owned 43.4% of Nissan. Nissan owned just 15% of Renault, and had no voting rights. In practice, this meant French control over Japanese assets. In practice, This meant billions in dividends flowing from Tokyo to Paris, while Nissan executives watched their independence erode year by year. For nearly 2 decades, Ghosn maintained this delicate balance through force of personality and undeniable results. But by 2017, cracks were forming. Nissan's performance was declining. Quality scandals were erupting, faked inspections, falsified fuel economy data. The alliance that once conquered the automotive world was showing its age, and Ghosn, now in his 60s, was contemplating his legacy. Here's where the story turns dark. Behind closed doors, Ghosn began pushing for a full merger, a complete integration of Renault and Nissan under a single corporate structure. He positioned it as the logical next step, the culmination of 20 years of partnership. But to Nissan executives, this wasn't evolution. This was colonization, a French takeover of one of Japan's crown jewel corporations, the erasure of Nissan as an independent entity. And here's the twist. The French government, which owned 15% of Renault, was pushing hard for this merger. This wasn't just corporate strategy. This was geopolitics disguised as business. This was a foreign government attempting to control a strategic Japanese industrial asset through corporate maneuvering. Inside Nissan headquarters, a counterplot was forming. What happened next wasn't a legal investigation. It was a corporate coup executed with the precision of a military operation. In early 2018, Nissan executives began a secret internal investigation into their own CEO. They didn't inform the board. They didn't inform Renault. They certainly didn't inform Ghosn. Working with external lawyers and investigators, they began combing through years of financial records, expense reports, compensation agreements, and corporate transactions. They were building a case. And they found what they were looking for, or at least what they needed. Allegations of underreported compensation, tens of millions in deferred payments that didn't appear in official disclosures, personal use of corporate assets, homes purchased by Nissan subsidiaries that Ghosn and his family used, suspicious payments to a Saudi businessman who allegedly helped Ghosn with personal financial problems, the transfer of investment losses from Ghosn's personal accounts to Nissan's books. Were these criminal acts, corporate governance violations, aggressive but legal executive compensation strategies, or completely fabricated charges designed to remove a CEO who had become too powerful, too threatening to Japanese corporate sovereignty? The truth remains murky, but what happened next was crystal clear. November 19th, 2018. Carlos Ghosn lands at Tokyo's Haneda Airport on his private jet, returning from a business trip. He's expecting a routine evening. Instead, as he steps off the plane, prosecutors and investigators swarm him. He's arrested on the tarmac, handcuffed, and taken directly to the Tokyo detention center. No warning, no chance to prepare a defense, no ability to access his corporate resources or legal team in those first critical hours. One moment, he's one of the most powerful executives in the world. The next, he's in a 7-by-10-foot cell with no heat, limited access to lawyers, and interrogations that stretched for hours without counsel present. This wasn't standard white-collar arrest procedure. This was designed to break him. Japan's criminal justice system has a 99% conviction rate. Suspects can be held for months without charges. Confessions are the primary goal, and the system is built to extract them. Within hours of his arrest, Nissan's board, without Ghosn present, voted to remove him as chairman. Mitsubishi followed. Renault initially resisted, but the pressure was immense. Within weeks, Ghosn's 20-year empire had collapsed. The alliance he built was now controlled by the very executives who had orchestrated his downfall. The merger with Renault. Dead. French government influence over Nissan. Neutralized. The threat to Japanese corporate independence. eliminated. But there's a darker layer to this business thriller. Several of the Nissan executives who led the investigation against Ghosn were later promoted to senior leadership positions. The CEO who took over, Hiroto Saikawa, was himself forced to resign a year later over his own financial misconduct, receiving improper compensation worth millions. No criminal charges were filed against him, no dramatic arrest, just a quiet resignation and a comfortable retirement. This wasn't about justice. This was about power. And Carlos Ghosn, sitting in that cold detention cell, began to understand he wasn't fighting a legal battle. He was fighting for his life against forces that wanted him erased. After 108 days in detention, Ghosn was finally granted bail in March 2019. The cost, $9 million. The conditions, surrender all passports, remain in Japan, no contact with his wife, 24/7 surveillance, restricted internet access, monitored communications. He moved into a modest house in Tokyo, modest by his standards at least, under constant watch. Cameras tracked his movements. His legal team faced constant obstacles. Key evidence was withheld. Witnesses were restricted. The trial date kept getting pushed back. In Japan's system, this could drag on for years, 5, even 10 years before a final verdict. Ghosn was 65 years old. If convicted, he faced 15 years in prison. Even if acquitted, a statistical near impossibility, he would have lost a decade of his life waiting for a trial in a foreign country that had already convicted him in the court of public opinion. But here's what prosecutors didn't understand about Carlos Ghosn. He didn't build a global automotive empire by accepting defeat. He didn't survive the cutthroat world of corporate restructuring by playing by rules that were rigged against him. And he certainly didn't plan to spend his final years in a Japanese prison for crimes he maintained he didn't commit. Somewhere in those monitored months, a decision crystallized. If the Japanese legal system wouldn't give him justice, he would give himself freedom, whatever the cost, whatever the risk, whatever it said about his guilt or innocence. He was going to escape. The escape plan was as audacious as it was insane, and it required help from people who operated in the shadows of international security. Enter Michael Taylor and his son Peter, former U.S. Special Forces operatives turned private security contractors. Michael Taylor had a reputation in certain circles: hostage rescue, high-risk extractions, operations in war zones. He'd worked for the U.S. military, for private corporations, for anyone who needed someone extracted from somewhere dangerous. This was his specialty, and Carlos Ghosn was about to become his most famous client. The details of how they connected remain murky, buried in encrypted communications and offshore payments. But by late December 2019, the plan was in motion. December 29th. Ghosn tells his lawyers and security monitors he's staying home for the evening. Instead, he walks out of his house, somehow evading the surveillance that was supposed to track his every movement. He meets the Taylors at a hotel in Tokyo. They've brought with them a large black case, the kind used for transporting audio equipment for concerts and events. It's big enough for a human, barely. At some point that evening, Carlos Ghosn, former CEO of a $200 billion alliance, one of the most recognizable faces in global business, climbs into that box. Breathing holes have been drilled into the sides. It's dark inside, cramped. He's 65 years old, not a young commando, but he folds himself into that darkness because the alternative is spending the rest of his life in a Japanese prison. The Taylors load the case onto a luggage cart. They take it through the hotel, into a van, and drive to Kansai International Airport, not the Tokyo airport where Ghosn originally landed and might be recognized, but a regional airport 300 miles away. They check in for a private charter flight to Istanbul. Now here's the critical detail. In Japan, private jet passengers typically don't go through the same security screening as commercial passengers. Luggage on private charters, especially large equipment cases, often aren't X-rayed. The assumption is that wealthy clients value privacy and convenience over security theater. This assumption was about to cost Japan one of its highest-profile defendants. The case containing Carlos Ghosn is loaded onto the private jet. No one checks inside. No one questions why concert equipment is being flown to Turkey. No one realizes that inside that box, barely able to breathe, is a man facing financial misconduct charges that have captivated the global business world. The jet takes off. Ghosn spends hours in that box in darkness as the plane crosses international borders. When it lands in Istanbul, he's transferred, still in the box, to another private jet. This one is bound for Beirut, Lebanon. Lebanon, where Ghosn holds citizenship. Lebanon, which has no extradition treaty with Japan. Lebanon, where his family has deep roots and influence. By the time Japanese authorities realize he's gone, by the time they check his house on December 31st and find it empty, Carlos Ghosn is already in Beirut, holding a press conference, declaring his innocence, and claiming he fled injustice and political persecution. The escape cost millions. The Taylors were allegedly paid $1.3 million, wired through cryptocurrency and offshore accounts. The private jets, the logistics, the safe houses, all carefully orchestrated and extraordinarily expensive. But for a man who once commanded an empire worth hundreds of billions, who lived in multiple mansions, and flew on private jets as casually as others take taxis, these were acceptable costs. This was the price of freedom. The aftermath. No winners in this business thriller. The escape should have been Carlos Ghosn's vindication. Instead, it became his confirmation of guilt in the eyes of many. Innocent people don't flee in boxes. Innocent people don't hire military contractors to smuggle them across international borders. Innocent people trust the legal system, even when it's flawed, even when it's slow, even when it's stacked against them. By running, Ghosn sacrificed any moral high ground he might have claimed. Japan was humiliated. One of the world's most advanced nations, with one of the strictest justice systems, had let its most high-profile defendant literally disappear in a box. Security protocols were overhauled. Heads rolled. International arrest warrants were issued for Ghosn, his wife Carol, and the Taylor family. The Taylors were eventually arrested in the United States and extradited to Japan, where they pleaded guilty and served prison time for their role in the escape. They sacrificed their freedom for a payday, and it cost them years behind bars in a foreign country. Carlos Ghosn remains in Lebanon, living in a mansion in Beirut, giving occasional interviews, maintaining his innocence, writing books about his persecution. He can never leave Lebanon without risking arrest through Interpol red notices. His assets in Japan were seized. His reputation, once bulletproof, is now permanently stained. He's trapped in a country experiencing economic collapse, political instability, and infrastructure failure. His gilded cage is now a failing state. The Renault-Nissan-Mitsubishi alliance he built. It limps on, weakened and fractious, without the strong hand that held it together. Nissan has struggled financially, posting massive losses, closing factories, laying off thousands. The very problems Ghosn was brought in to solve in 1999 have returned like a corporate curse. Leadership turnover has been constant, scandals have multiplied, and the company that once thrived under his ruthless efficiency now flounders without direction. And here's the darkest twist in this business scandal documentary. We still don't actually know the truth. The unanswered questions. Was Carlos Ghosn guilty of financial misconduct? Almost certainly to some degree. Executive compensation at his level exists in gray zones where legality and ethics blur, where corporate money and personal benefit intertwine, where the line between legitimate perks and illegal embezzlement depends on contracts written by lawyers whose job is to maximize ambiguity. But were his alleged crimes worth the dramatic arrest, the harsh detention, the show trial that never happened? Or was he targeted because he threatened Japanese corporate independence, because he pushed too hard for a merger that would have given French government influence over a Japanese icon? The truth, as always in stories of wealth and power, is probably somewhere in the murky middle. Ghosn was likely both. A brilliant executive who saved failing companies, and a man who believed the rules didn't apply to him. A visionary leader and a corporate imperialist who lived like royalty on shareholder money. A victim of a politically motivated prosecution, and someone who absolutely used his position for personal enrichment in ways that crossed legal and ethical lines. This is the reality of business at the highest levels. There are rarely heroes or villains, only people playing a game where the rules are written by those with power and rewritten whenever someone threatens that power. If you're building wealth, building power, building an empire, pay attention to what this dark business story reveals about the machinery that really runs the corporate world. First, power without allies is temporary. Ghosn accumulated extraordinary authority, but alienated the very executives he needed on his side. He ruled through fear and results, not loyalty. When the knives came out, no one stood with him. Second, geopolitics always trumps corporate strategy. When your business decisions threaten national interests, whether you realize it or not, you're playing a game where the rules can change instantly and retroactively. Ghosn thought he was executing brilliant corporate strategy. He didn't realize he was triggering a nationalist backlash. Third, legal systems are weapons, not arbiters of truth. In corporate warfare, prosecutors and courts can be deployed as strategic assets to remove threats, extract concessions, or send messages. The law is whatever serves power in that moment. Fourth, the escape paradox. By fleeing, Ghosn proved his resourcefulness, his determination, his willingness to risk everything. He also destroyed any chance of ever clearing his name. He's free but forever guilty in the court of public opinion. Sometimes the choice isn't between good options and bad options. It's between different kinds of loss. And finally, at the very top of the corporate pyramid, everyone is expendable. No matter how many companies you save, how many billions you generate, how indispensable you seem, the system will eject you the moment you become more of a liability than an asset. Your legacy, your reputation, your freedom, all can be stripped away with a single board vote and a coordinated legal assault. Carlos Ghosn is 71 years old now, living in forced exile in a country teetering on the edge of collapse. He gives interviews claiming vindication that never comes. He writes memoirs arguing for innocence that few believe. He watches the alliance he built crumble from a distance, unable to intervene, unable to return, unable to escape the consequences of his escape. Was he a visionary executive destroyed by xenophobic nationalism, a corporate criminal who got away, a victim of both his own hubris and a rigged system, or simply a man who played the game of wealth and power at the highest levels and discovered, too late, that at the top there are no rules, only power, and those with power will always protect it against those who threaten it? On December 29, 2019, a man who once commanded one of the world's largest industrial empires folded himself into a box with breathing holes drilled into the sides. He lay in darkness as he was wheeled through airports, loaded onto planes, smuggled across borders like contraband. For hours, he couldn't move, couldn't speak, couldn't be sure the plan would work, or if he'd be discovered and sent back to a Japanese prison for the rest of his life. That image, that humiliating, desperate, absurd image of a billionaire CEO hiding in a box, is the perfect symbol for what happens when corporate power meets forces more powerful than quarterly earnings and market capitalization. Because in the end, in the cold darkness of that box, Carlos Ghosn wasn't a CEO. He wasn't a visionary or a criminal. He was just a man who had run out of options, betting everything on one last desperate escape from a system designed to grind him into submission. And perhaps that's the most chilling lesson of all. No matter how high you climb, how much power you accumulate, how invincible you seem, there's always a box waiting, somewhere in the shadows, with your name already written on the side. The only question is whether you see it coming before someone closes the lid. Subscribe and listen to our next story below.